City's Dallas Police Chief Eddie Garcia and the National Vice President for the Fraternal Order of Police, Sergeant Joe Gamaldi. All right, gentlemen, you know, Biden is touting his new crime strategy on assault weapons, and it doesn't appear, and I could be wrong, but I'll ask you, does it appear that he's on the right track to stop gun violence in the United States? I'll start with you, Chief Garcia.
Well, thank you for having me. And although I think I can speak for my colleagues in other major cities across America, we appreciate the fact that we've recognized that there's an increase in violent crime, and we're recognizing that we need to do something about it. And furthermore, the messaging, recognizing that defunding and dismantling police departments is not the answer. However, although we do have an issue with weapons and illegally possessed weapons being possessed by criminals committing harm on our cities, the data just simply doesn't back up the fact that guns are the simply only driver. We do a lot of work with criminologists here in the city of Dallas that we brought in to help us with our issues. And as they'll point out, when crime was at its peak in the 80s, there were many less weapons in circulation than there are today. There are many more weapons that are in circulation than there are today, and than there was when violence was at its peak in the 80s, since criminologists have been studying crime in America. And so simply stating that guns are the only driver.
Right. What do you think the driver is?
Well, it's really quite a combination of things. I mean, nationally, particularly because of dismantling, defunding combination, you have officer morale, where honorable, respective officers have felt under siege, unappreciated, undervalued. They're human, and that impacts their work productivity. And so what's happened is we've lost proactive police engagement where we need it the most.
That's right.
Yes, we need to be more professional and better as an organization, but we've somewhat lost that.
Okay, I'll go to Joseph Gamaldi, Vice President of the National Fraternal Order of Police. Tell me what Biden said right and what he said wrong.
Well, I think it's important that he acknowledged that defunding the police is a complete loser, but yet we still have politicians in the media gaslighting the American public to believe that this is some sort of solution. And the fact of the matter is they're charlatans selling snake oil to the public. And I'll tell you where the president missed the mark. He didn't talk about rogue prosecutors and activist judges who continue this revolving door criminal justice system that we have. We have gang members who are shooting people, getting probation. We have gang members that are out on 8 felony bonds, and then they're getting another bond. These revolving door policies and bail reform have been an unmitigated disaster for our communities. And you compound that with the anti-police rhetoric and denigrating the hardworking men and women in law enforcement, and it's a recipe for disaster. And that's why you saw in 2020 we had over 20,000 homicides in the United States. That hasn't happened since the mid-90s. And then the cities that actually decided it was a good idea to defund the police, let's look at their numbers. Portland, their murders jumped by 137%. Minneapolis, remember them? Up 236%. Yep. New York up 48%. Philly 66%. And the list goes on and on. So we want to talk about zero tolerance. How about we have zero tolerance for the people who are shooting people in the face, and let's throw the book at them.
Yeah, well, and people who are shooting children, Chief Garcia, you know, what Joe was saying is absolutely the case. I mean, we've got an increase in the tolerance of hate toward police, tying police's hands behind their backs, putting a target on their backs. I mean, does Joe Biden think anybody believes what he's saying, that 90% of the crimes that are street crimes occur as a result of sales from 5% of gun sales? Gun sale purchasers? I mean, is that crazy? Does that number sound legit to you?
Well, I'll say, you know what, I'll say this, and I consider myself a street cop, and remember when I was on patrol.
Is that a legitimate number? Do you believe for 1 second what he said, that 90% of the crimes, the gun crimes that occur in America, occur as a result of those same guns being sold by 5% of the gun dealers? Is that a legitimate statistic? Well, yes or no?
Well, I don't know that data.
Come on, Chief.
It doesn't seem. Well, I don't know the data. It does not seem reasonable to me. But I haven't drilled down to those numbers. But no, it doesn't seem reasonable to me.
Nothing to drill. Okay, go ahead. What were you going to say?
All right, what I was going to say was, you know, we talk about the officers and feeling undervalued. We don't, you know what? Our officers have to answer 911 calls for service. But we can't force our officers to conduct investigative car stops or do the type of investigations needed that yield the types of drugs and weapons and other things possessed by criminals that are harming our communities. They will only do that if they feel appreciated and feel that they're going to be judged fairly in a crisis, and that they feel that procedural justice applies to them as well. What was said earlier with regards to the revolving door, there is a perception, true or not, nationally, and unfortunately there are many examples, and many of my colleagues will tell you, that violent criminals are not being held accountable. This leads to a thinking that in some way social controls are being lessened, which further erodes the morale of police officers and then emboldens the violent criminals to think that no one's watching. And it ultimately affects our communities the most.
Well, and Joe Grimaldi, I mean, the chief is right. They are emboldened to believe that no one's watching. And even if they are watching, we're letting them out. I mean, we've got gang members out to kill again. We've got street thugs out to assault another person. I mean, it's just over and over. I mean, will somebody talk about bail reform? Is any of this going to happen, or are we just going to have to live with this and buy our own guns?
You know, I certainly hope that we continue to have discussions about how much of an unmitigated disaster this bail reform has been. And in fact, a study from the University of Utah showed that Cook County, which is Chicago, was a complete failure in their bail reform, and people were reoffending on violent crimes at over 50%. But the fact of the matter is, Judge, law enforcement in this country, the American police officer, delivered historic crime reductions over the last 2 decades. And we can do it again if we're willing to restore the rule of law, which means not letting off hundreds of people in New York who are rioting and looting a few months back. And if we prosecute violent crimes to the fullest extent to the law, and we embrace broken windows theories, we can do it again. But we need the funding, and we need the support from our community and our politicians.
Okay, and finally, Chief Garcia, if you could have just one thing in the next 15 seconds, what would that one thing be? Would it be to change the laws? Would it be funding? What would it be if you had a wish list?
If I had a wish list, I'd keep it simple. As we talk about the issues with guns, et cetera, if we could simply just hold the individuals that are illegally possessing weapons, that are criminals, that are hold those individuals accountable to the fullest extent possible, we certainly can move the needle.
Well, Chief Garcia, Sergeant Joe Grimaldi, thank you so much for being with us on this topic that makes me crazy.